Hey everybody. So in our last session, we set the groundwork for discussions of GMOs by finding out what DNA was and how it works, what the genetic paradigm is. Gave you a little bit of the history of that, and it was a brief discussion of um, how humans have affected the genetic composition of plants and animals over the course of our human history. Now we're going to start with the contemporary era of humans' ability to shape the phenotype of a plant or an animal. That is, the observable traits of a plant or an animal by directly modifying the genome or the set of genes that describes the growth and behavior of an organism. So this first lecture on this first section is all about GMO plants, and I'm going to break this up into two sections. The first of them is this A part is it's still, even though we're talking about GMO plants, it's all about the meat. All right, so there is the GMO poll that I asked you to take about your comfort level with GMOs in the last video. And I asked you whether you wanted labels on GMO products and how much of the processed foods in the U.S. contain GMOs, and would you buy any foods that contain GMOs? So to answer those questions, here are the actual numbers. You got credit regardless of what you answered, but 93% of Americans want labels on their GMO products. 80% of all processed foods in the U.S. contain GMOs. And then 53% of Americans said they wouldn't buy foods containing GMOs. So let's think about those three numbers for a minute. Yeah, almost every American wants GMO labels on products. If they were going to buy it, they would want to know that it had been genetically modified. And 80% of all processed foods, this means foods that have gone through some sort of processing, right? It's not just like an apple or something like a whole food like that, but ketchup instead, for example, is a processed food. 80% of all the processed foods in the U.S. have some kind of genetically modified organism, and certainly they're not labeled as such. And then over half of Americans wouldn't buy that food if they knew it had GMOs. Well, I guess that's why there's no labeling. So they said they wouldn't buy the foods, but they are buying the foods. They are eating the genetically modified organisms. All right, so are GMOs good or bad? What is it? It's kind of confusing. We're going to try to look at some of the perspectives on both sides of that coin. I'm not going to necessarily tell you the answer whether GMOs are good or bad. It's definitely not a binary question like that. All right, so I have some data on this poll that I asked a class in a previous year, and this is how they responded. So, do people in this class want GMO labels? Well, they said 94% of the class said yes, they do. Well, that is essentially a mirror of the U.S. population. How much processed food has GMOs? Well, the class said 77%, and the U.S. overall said about 80%. So, would you buy GMO foods? And it was 58% in the class and 53% USO overall. So, there is pretty good correlation with the U.S. statistics. And then last year I had asked another question: do people understand GMOs? Do you know what the hell a GMO is? We're talking about it. I haven't really dove into it yet for any of you. Half the class had a decent understanding, 30% had no idea, and then maybe a fifth of it said, maybe, I don't know. U.S. overall, 70% of the population has no idea what a GMO is at all. And so they're forming these opinions based largely on emotional reactions rather than an actual understanding of the issue. Unsurprisingly, that's the era we live in. People forming opinions without understanding what they're forming an opinion about. Anyways, so let's try to make sure that you are not amongst that group of Americans, that large group of Americans that have no idea what this is at all. So on the left is conventional breeding, and this is what we were talking about in the last series of lectures. Like agriculture, animal husbandry, domestication of animals, etc. This is conventional breeding. So it's this deliberate interbreeding process where you're taking either closely or distantly related individuals of the same species that are able to sexually reproduce with one another and which have desirable traits in each of the two strains of that organism, and you're breeding them with one another, and it's yielding a plant or an animal that has a combination of both the desirable traits. It can take quite a while, right? So here's an example: corn. You have a virus-resistant strain, but it doesn't really pump out that much corn. And then you have a really nice high yield, but it's very susceptible to disease. Cross them with one another, and that can take many generations over many years to get a virus-resistant and high-yield crop. But you can kind of cut the line on biology here by cutting and pasting, by taking the desirable genes from both of the two plants in a lab and then combining them, manipulating them. Genetic modification, genetic manipulation. It's the direct manipulation of that organism's genes using various biotechnological tools that we're going to talk about in just a little bit more detail. So you can get kind of the same result by doing this. History. This technology first was introduced, the foundation for the technology at least was first introduced in 1973. You probably wouldn't have guessed this, or maybe you would have, that the first genetically engineered organism was a very simple organism, a bacteria. There was a bacteria with antibiotic resistance, right? So people take a lot of antibiotics and they develop resistance. The bacteria develop resistance. These two, Herbert Boyer and Stanley Cohn, had back in the 60s identified that gene for antibiotic resistance. They extracted that gene and from the bacteria and isolated it and created a little plasmid, which is just a loop of DNA, and then they micro-injected it, literally with a teeny tiny super small needle. They injected that gene back into a wild-type bacteria that did not have resistance to the antibiotic, and then it transformed that bacteria into one that was now resistant to the antibiotic. So this was the first demonstration of principle. Pretty significant step forward. So what is a GMO? Genetic modification. It's the direct human manipulation of an organism's DNA in a laboratory setting. So you're inserting a gene from one organism into the genome or the full collection of genes of another organism that's incapable of breeding with the first. So an example is, and this is a controversial example that has been discussed recently, Some scientists have taken the marmoset genome. Marmoset are these cute little primates here. And they wanted to study the genes, the effects of the genes that have been identified in human schizophrenia. So they took the genes that have been implicated in human schizophrenia and spliced them into the marmoset genome, and then raised these marmosets with this gene for human schizophrenia. I'm sure that was not fun for the marmosets, which is why this is a controversial issue, genetically modifying other primates. That's pretty close to home. But that's just an example of what a genetically modified organism is. So the commercial sale of any kind of genetically modified food happened first in 1994 when a company called Calgene first marketed the ultimately unsuccessful Flavor Saver tomato. It was a delayed ripening tomato, so that you were able to get it to the store shelves while it was at its peak, the most delicious state. I have a number of science media supplements up on the posted for you there, so you can read a little bit more about the backstory. It's pretty interesting how Calgene succeeded and failed, both. So one of the things that they don't talk about in those things that I just found kind of interesting was the fact that it was a tomato. These people clearly were spending a lot of time in the lab in the 70s and may not have been paying as much attention to the silly media that was happening. So, the reality of these tomatoes, they were delicious. Apparently, I never had one, but they were delicious, very prime ripening features. The phenotype of these tomatoes was great. However, the public had this horrible perception of them. So the tomato came out in 1994. Less than 20 years earlier, about 15 years earlier, there was this kind of cult movie, Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, that had come up. These tomatoes from outer space or whatever were wreaking havoc on the planet. Kind of a ridiculous movie, but it had planted a seed, so to speak, in the mass psyche. So that little aspect of the Flavor Saver story wasn't actually explored in that media, but I thought it was an interesting connection. Okay, so how do we do this? Say you want to do it yourself in your dorm room or your house or a garage or something like that. How might you go about doing that? Well, you would take a bacteria or some other kind of organism, and whatever that organism is, you're going to extract the DNA from it using molecular biology techniques that are at this point quite standard. You will take that gene that you're interested in and clip it out and insert it into other genes, a larger genome, a larger genetic context for the organism that you're interested in. And then you will go through a process of transformation where that new genome that is a combination of the old genes from the larger genome of the primary organism, and then the gene from the secondary organism that has the trait that you are particularly interested in. For a plant, you would then insert that gene into a plant cell, culture it out in a petri dish, and then eventually that culture would be able to form the foundation for a plant that you could eventually grow up and enter into a normal breeding process. All right. So when a biotechnologist is creating one of these genetically modified plants, there's really two different categories of traits that a GMO plant is going to have, and or even an animal might have. There are producer-oriented modifications and consumer-oriented modifications. The flavor saver tomato was an example of a consumer-oriented modification. That is to say, a modification that is something that you, as the person eating the fruit or vegetable, would say, oh, wow, look at that. That's different than whatever I've had before. So some examples of consumer-oriented modifications are improved nutritional value, or perhaps they produce some kind of edible oil that they may not have before. That's a common thing. It could lead to vitamin enrichment or toxin reduction. There are other consumer-oriented modifications, so like tearless onions, seedless tomatoes, on and on. However, the majority of genetically modified traits are actually not about you, the consumer, at all. They are about the farmer or some other person in the production chain, and they make it easier in some way to get that food from the ground to your plate, from farm to table. So what are some examples? So you have the extended shelf life, or maybe it photosynthesizes better, it grows more robustly. This next category is extremely common, herbicide resistance. So that is a plant that is not susceptible to herbicide that is dangerous to other plants. So there's all kinds of herbicide resistant traits, so resistance to glyphosate, bromoxynil, glufosinate, dicamba, 2,4-D, etc. So you can have genes that confer pest resistance. So put some gene in the plant that if an insect starts chewing on it, the insect does not like it. Or perhaps some kind of resistance to virus that a plant might be susceptible to. On and on. There are a couple other interesting producer-oriented modifications. Bioremediation is an interesting one. Say you have soil that has heavy metal contamination. You can have genetically modified crops that if you plant them, they will extract the heavy metals from the soil, and then you can harvest the crop, thus removing soil that would be extremely expensive and difficult to get out of that soil otherwise. So bioremediation is a pretty interesting genetically modified application, or an application for genetically modified plants. Okay, so here's some facts. Most of the genetically modified plants that are out there are right here on this chart. So more than 90% of corn, soybean, cotton, canola, and sugar beet acreage in the U.S. is GMO. Very little of the U.S. commodity crops are sold directly to consumers as food. Most of the soybean, the cotton, and the corn are genetically modified, and 90% of that soy and 50% of the corn is being used for what? Well, to make your Big Mac, to make meat. So animal feed is a tremendous end use for all this genetically engineered crops in the U.S. Also ethanol. They use corn. A lot of corn goes into ethanol production. So, and most of these crops, the corn, the soy, and the cotton, so that's the big three, corn, soy, and cotton, those use the genetically modified trait for those crops is far and away the largest trait found in those crops is herbicide resistance, right? So resistance to any of these things such as glyphosate, 2,4-D, dicamba, atrazine. And so this is for corn and for maize and for soy. So this is to say that the widespread use of genetically modified organisms implies intense use of herbicides, right? If you're using GMOs, you're using herbicides. They kind of go together. So you'll have a gene set that enables you to use a certain kind of herbicide that'll kill everything except the crops you're interested in. Yeah. All right. We had looked at that earlier statistic that the vast majority of the processed foods out there that are available contain some sort of genetically modified ingredient. Why is that? Well, it turns out it's because of one ingredient. High fructose corn syrup is pretty much always going to be genetically modified, and it's in freaking everything. The benefit of using genetically modified organisms aside, whether it's a good thing or not, the prevalence of high fructose corn syrup in our food supply is a real health problem that we're going to talk about more in the carbohydrate section. So even though a product is not labeled genetically modified, there is currently no regulation around that. There have been some attempts, and there have been motion in that direction, but it's not currently mandated. Although we'll talk about that a little bit later, another lecture here. But if you look on the back of an ingredient label, if you know the backstory, if you know what you're looking at, you can tell whether it is or not. So this organic tomato ketchup, it doesn't say, well, I guess it does. It says no GMO ingredients right on it. But the regular ketchup doesn't say that. And you can look on the label. It says high fructose corn syrup. That is the 1 to 3rd ingredient behind tomatoes and vinegar, followed by just corn syrup. So high fructose corn syrup and corn syrup, both of those are coming from genetically modified corn. So if you've ever had any non-organic ketchup or non-organic mustard, then you've had genetically modified foods before. Unless a food explicitly says that it's not GMO, then it's a processed food. It's probably a good chance that it is GMO. Looking at the ingredient list will help you know what you're looking at. So, how do GMO crops work? Well, let's see. Here is farmers' crops, and we spray we plant a bunch of seeds that have a bunch of soybeans that are so-called Roundup ready. That means that you can spray Roundup on it and they are totally immune to it. It doesn't do anything to the soybeans, but it kills everything else. The dandelions don't have the glyphosate resistance gene that these soybeans do. And so we kill off the dandelions and we have beautiful, clean rows of soybeans that look lush in the sunshine. Okay, well, why would you do that? Hey, there are a number of reasons to recommend this kind of farming. So first of all, it is a very efficient form of weed control that's very broad spectrum. You can't go out and weed, 1,000 acres or more by hand very efficiently. There are other ways of dealing with that, but this is extremely efficient. and it also fits in with minimum tillage. So it lessens the amount of time you have to till the soil. That's actually good for the soil. Doing a whole bunch of tilling for the soil isn't especially good for the soil. Um, and it turns out that glyphosate and any of these pesticides or herbicides, pardon me, that they're using are meant to be biodegradable, that they do break down relatively rapidly in the environment. But here, show me the money. Cost effective. They're very cost effective. So $13 billion apparently in cost savings to U.S. farmers using glyphosate versus conventional soybeans in the year 2008. That's the most recent year I could find data for. Let's look at this chart. This is showing the impact of using Roundup Ready soybeans on the agricultural margins in Romania. And you can see that conventional soybeans in blue versus Roundup Ready soybeans lead to much larger profit margins for these farms. And when a farm is operating on a super razor thin margin, and particularly with global climate change, when there's a higher chance for crops to fail, those margins, buffering those margins can be really important. We have to feed an extremely large population. So it can serve as an economic buffer in volatile times. So here's an interesting chart looking at the cost of soybean export prices that soybeans were fetching throughout the Trump era. So Trump came into office. There was the trade war and the imposition of Chinese tariffs. As soon as so the trade war that Trump started triggered these Chinese tariffs to be slapped on U.S. soybeans, which China was one of the largest importers of U.S. soybeans, and that caused the price of Chinese soy to take a nosedive. And it did until the U.S. increased U.S. farm subsidies about 6 months later to try to stabilize that price, because U.S. farmers were getting hammered by these tariffs that China had imposed during that. So a lot of loss of income in U.S. farmers at that time. So anyways, having a wider profit margin on your crops, that is, what helped a lot of these farmers survive this volatile price fluctuations that can come from things that are entirely outside of their control, like a trade war, for example, or the unpredictability of global climate change. The only thing predictable about it is that it's going to be changing a lot. So there are a number of reasons to think that genetically modified crops are an important part of the food strategy. In fact, it's probably there's really no way to feed a population the size of what we're carrying on the earth right now without this kind of technology. Is that right? I don't know. So, all right. That's that section, trying to give you some of the background on what GMO is and some of the rationale behind why it's used. Tune in for the next section, where I will talk about some of the downsides.